we tend to think of international law as being the opposite of power politics or the negation of power politics. But a lot of scholars and critics are going to point out that there's still law. I'm sorry, there's still power in international law. And so that's what we want to talk about, right? We finished our last video with this battle of the partners game, and we pointed out that how this gets resolved sort of has to be driven by power of one sort or another, and also then it has implications for the distribution of benefits in the future. So these are questions about power. And the question I really want to get at here is, does international law help the weak constrain the powerful, right? In all kinds of law, we think that one of the things that law does that's good is prevent people with power from abusing their power, right? And of course, in the domestic situation, that sometimes works better than others, but we want to ask this question about international law. Does it help the weak constrain the powerful, or in fact, is it a means by which the powerful exert their control over the weak? And a variety of theoretical perspectives, realism, economic structuralism, and oftentimes, although not necessarily, feminism is going to contend that that's exactly what international law is. It's part of an overarching power structure by which the strong control the weak. And some of these folks, and especially the economic and structuralists and feminists, will contend, and therefore international law needs to be reformed so it does a better job protecting the weak against the powerful. Right? The realists are going to say, good luck with that. So the first question we ask is, how do the rules get written? Right? And to what extent then does that determine whose interests they serve? And the basic argument here is that the powerful countries have an outsized role in determining what becomes international law in the first place. In some cases, they agree among themselves about what the rules are going to be, and then they sort of pressure others to sign on. In other cases, they may use the various forms of leverage they have to get the laws written in ways that they like, rather than the ways that others like. And just to give one example that I think is a great illustration is, we don't think of Britain or the United Kingdom as being a weak country. But when the Bretton Woods economic institutions were formed after World War II, the United States had a very clear idea of how it wanted those institutions to look. And on some of the really important issues, the United Kingdom disagreed, particularly on issues related to British colonies, as you can imagine. And the United States basically said, look, you don't have to agree with us if you don't want. But if you don't agree with us, we're not going to let you into our trading group. So it was basically take it or leave it. And from an economic position, especially after the devastation of World War II, the British basically said, wow, we can't be outside of this system, so even if we don't like the way the U.S. has designed it, we've got to be in. And the point I'm trying to get here is if the United Kingdom kind of could have that sort of power exerted on them, then you can imagine a lot of weaker and poorer countries might be vulnerable as well. And again, it's not that it was the worst thing ever. It's that they had to agree to a solution which they didn't really like because it was better than the alternative, right? Better than nothing. Think again about our battle of the partners game. The other question then is, how does international law get enforced? All right, so I'm sorry to say we're back to this question of enforcement. And again, the notion of law in the abstract and in the ideal is it gets enforced equally regardless of who the perpetrator is, who the victim is, what the situation is, right? That's the notion of law, is the same thing happens in the same circumstances. The question we're going to ask is international law enforced consistently and effectively against the powerful as it is against the weak? So just to give one example, and there are jillions of them, why was there intervention to stop the human rights abuses in Kosovo, which was part of Yugoslavia, a relatively weak country, but not in Chechnya, part of Russia, a powerful country, or Tibet, part of China? And the answer is, well, it was possible for the United States and its allies to coerce Yugoslavia at a reasonable amount of danger. In other words, we weren't really worried that Yugoslavia was going to bomb the United States with or without nuclear weapons. Russia, we weren't going to start a war with Russia over Chechnya because, of course, Russia has an incredibly powerful military, nuclear weapons. Same thing with China and Tibet. Well, what about the case of Rwanda, which happened, about at the same time as the first Chechen War and as the issue in Yugoslavia? In Rwanda, it wasn't necessarily that anybody was deterring us from intervening. It's just that the West basically decided it didn't care. And so not just human rights abuses, but genocide took place in Rwanda because nobody cared enough to enforce the law. So the big point here is that international law seems to get enforced only when the powerful states decide that it gets enforced. Most of the countries of the world didn't really have the capacity to enforce law in these cases. So the point then is, if international law requires states to enforce it, right, because there's no international police force and no international prosecutors and so on, or really very little, then only the powerful can enforce it, and that skews enforcement, as I've just said, and it makes the powerful immune from enforcement. So this is not really sounding much like law at all now. The dilemma for weak states is this, and it's kind of the dilemma that I pointed out in the case of the UK with the Bretton Woods system. Is it better to have an international law that is shaped by the powerful and enforced unevenly, or to have a situation in which there is no international law, right? And then the point is when there's no international law, when there's no constraints on what the strong do, right, then the weak are potentially in an even worse position. And so as the British found, in many cases, the weaker states find that it's better to agree on skewed, imperfect international law than to have no international law whatsoever. But you can imagine that leads to a fair amount of resentment. And so one of the questions then is for the future is, can international law be made fair? There's a huge discussion that's been going on for decades now about reforming the United Nations Security Council, for example, to make it more equitable. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, many of the countries of the world have agreed, starting in 1968, not to get nuclear weapons as long as others didn't. But part of that agreement as well is that the countries that did have nuclear weapons and were going to keep them under the treaty committed themselves to reducing their nuclear arsenals over time. And there have been arguments made by some of the non-nuclear states that the nuclear states haven't sufficiently done what they committed to do. And so there's sort of increasing pressure from countries that could get nuclear weapons but haven't yet to say, look, you guys have to do what you said if you want to keep on getting us to do what we said. Another great example is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which we'll talk about in our next lecture. But this was a case where the weak states of the world, in some respects, had some power, because the powerful states, the wealthy states, were saying, basically, we want you to stop polluting. The atmosphere is in lousy shape because we got rich by polluting, but now it's in lousy shape, and so we need you not to pollute. And the poor countries have been able to say, look, we don't have any interest in doing that unless you're going to help us pay for it. And so sometimes there might be some circumstances in which international law might be made fair, but it might simply still depend on the distribution of power on any particular issue.